So our next inductee is Bill Dickens, and I promise I'm not going to keep diverting here. I know I'm just the MC, but I would not be standing up here, I don't think, if it wasn't for Bill Dickens. Not because he saved my life in a medical emergency or anything like that. My wife Lindsay and I moved back to Iowa from South Dakota in 2006. I was a SANI scholar in 1996, and the company that I worked for said you should think about being philanthropic as you grow your career. And I said, you know what, you're right. The SANI meant the world to me, and it was time for me to give back. And so I did. I wrote a check, sent it over, and didn't think anything of it. And a few days later, my phone rang, and it was this guy named Bill Dickens. And he said, hey, who are you? And I said, I'm Steve. Who are you? And he said, well, I work with the Iowa Golf Association. Do you want to get together for breakfast at Perkins? And I'm like, I mean, can I order a tremendous 12? Because if I can, I'm in. And he said, yeah, that's fine. And so we sat down, and he asked me a few questions. And within, I think, a couple of weeks, I was on the SANI selection committee. And within a few weeks, it seems like after that, I was being voted in as a member of the Iowa Golf Association Board of Directors. You will not find anybody who is more deeply passionate about his team and about the IGA than Bill. He has truly got a heart of gold. I think the world of him, and I think the world of the group that's going to introduce him up here, because he is going to be introduced up by the Iowa Golf Association staff. So I think, Chad, am I bringing you all up together? Chad Pitts, Clint Brown, Caitlin Hoganson, here to introduce Bill Dickens.
Steve's the best, isn't he? He really is. I already introduced myself, but I'll do it again. I'm Chad Pitts, Executive Director of the Iowa Golf Association. With me up here is Clint and Caitlin. We're all members of the Iowa Golf Association staff. And what's really cool is Bill hired all of us as interns to start our careers. And then he made the extremely wise decision to hire us full-time as well. So, thank you, Bill. We're all grateful. Bill hired me as an intern in 2002, which was right after the IGA and the Iowa PGA split offices. Bill was the sole employee of the IGA for a few months, and that meant he had to relocate the office, he had to purchase a bunch of needed equipment, he had to hire a whole new staff, and he soon found out that he had a lot of teaching to do. In those first few years, he taught board members and staff members alike what running a proper amateur golf association was all about. That included teaching us that the IGA was more than just running tournaments. And by the way, we didn't run tournaments. Bill instilled that we ran championships, and we still run championships. The importance of governance, the identity of our membership, the value of proper course and slope ratings, what it meant to teach the rules of golf, what it meant to teach the rules of handicapping, all of that programming got a huge upgrade when Bill Dickens took over. Many people have stated how Bill was the perfect person at the perfect time for the IGA. I believe that to be true. When the IGA and the Iowa PGA split offices in the early 2000s, those next few years were tumultuous, to say it nicely. But Bill led the IGA through those rocky times, and he always had the best interest of the association as the focal point. And that was what I think was unique about Bill, and that's why people said he was the perfect guy at the perfect time. There's many times he could have chosen to do the easy thing, could have kept the status quo, could have not upset the apple cart, but that wasn't Bill's nature. That wasn't the way he was. He knew what was right for the IGA, and he was going to fight for it. So even though it wasn't the easiest process, that's what he did. So I'm proud to say that now both the IGA and the Iowa PGA have come through that rocky stretch better than ever. We're on tremendously cordial grounds. It's probably the best relationship we've had between the two associations that I can remember. And that's because we went through those rocky times and we figured out what worked best for the two organizations. And Bill was at the head of all of that. And so after we got through all that, he identified something else that the IGA needed, and that was a true 501c3 foundation.
Like Steve said, and I want to reiterate this, I wouldn't be standing up here if it wasn't for Bill. Was an intern in 03. I've often wondered, like, did the mailman lose a lot of the resumes that year? But Bill gave me a chance, and I'm forever grateful. In 2015, he called me back to the ship, and we've been rocking and rolling ever since. But anyway, back in the early days of the IGA, donations would come in, partners program, scholarship donations. Things were said to be tax deductible. They weren't, probably. But I think enough time has passed for anyone to worry about that, I think. Bill realized and knew that the IGA needed an avenue for these types of gifts and donations to be taken in an appropriate way. Thus began the beginning of the IGA Foundation, which involved several hours and pages of paperwork, forms, and so much more for the IRS in order to establish the foundation. Well, as you can imagine, going back and forth with the IRS isn't like tapping in that par putt after rolling it close from 30 feet. But Bill stayed the course and got the job done. Without Bill's vision, forward thinking, programs such as the Herman Sani and Ann Griffel scholarships, turf and environmental research, youth on course, partners program, and nights like this involving the Iowa Golf Hall of Fame would not see the success nor the continued support we have seen since Bill got the IGA Foundation off the ground. It wasn't always easy, but rarely anything really worth doing is. It's just another testament to Bill's determination and willingness to take on the task, full steam ahead. With the IGA Foundation on steady ground, the next chapter of Bill's legacy began with another vision, Golf House Iowa. Once again, not an easy task to tackle, and looking back, maybe seemed like a cause that would need to be shelved completely, which maybe it was for a few years, but never out of sight. Thankfully, Bill kept the flame burning and kept that idea alive. Before ideas of a golf house took flight, though, Bill undertook the steps to begin the process of bringing the Iowa Golf Association and the Women's Golf Association together. I'll let Caitlin tell you more about that.
All right, so as Chad said, hired on by Bill, started in 2011 as a boat ride intern with the Iowa Women's Golf Association. Actually worked with Noelle, who's here tonight, great seeing her. And then hired on full-time in 2012. But during those first few years, the IGA and the IWGA merger was definitely a big discussion amongst the boards and Bill Dickens as the executive director. The process had actually started probably a decade before that, so they'd been putting in a lot of work with that, but ultimately the goal was to have an association that served all golfers under one entity. I remember when we would attend regional association meetings and things like that around the country, they were talking about at that time how they were just starting the process of talking about merging with their state associations and wanting to become one in different states, and Bill and our board of directors had already been working on that for a decade. So it was amazing to feel like Iowa was ahead of the curve in that way. In 2014, that was when the official merger took place. It is crazy that it's been a decade since that milestone, and I'll say it was wonderful to celebrate the 100th Women's Am this year as one association. So I think that's such a huge moment for us in Iowa here. So I just want to thank Bill so much for his support of women's golf and for seeing the importance of uniting those associations.
So as you've heard about tonight, the facility that many of you experienced earlier, Golf House Iowa, truly did start with Bill's vision. He tried hard to get it going in the late 2000s, but then the recession hit. We also rightly determined that maybe there's a few other things that needed priority, such as securing the Sani. Thanks again, Mike, for your help there. And then we tried again in 2019. And then 2020, we had something happen. So it felt like we were cursed a little bit, but by the time the pandemic kind of settled down and we got things going again, as Mike and Steve and Charlie talked about in 2021, we finally got the fundraising really kick-started. By then, Bill had fully retired from the IGA, but please understand that that building isn't there without his initial vision and idea behind that, and Bill, we're forever grateful for that. So now, Bill's being inducted in the Iowa Golf Hall of Fame for his contributions as a golf administrator. But what you might not know is Bill has been a terrific golfer himself over his years. He played collegiately at Michigan State, and I think that's where he met Mr. Jeff Rivard, who I bet you'll hear Bill talk a little bit about Jeff's impact on Bill's career as a golf administrator. But to tell one quick story that kind of illustrates Bill's prowess as a golfer, he and Jeff would often pair up, I've learned, as four-ball partners. And they would travel the state of Michigan looking for four-ball tournaments to play in, and I understand there might have even been an organization that only ran four-ball championships, and they would participate in a lot of those. And the reason was, as Bill would put it, was to get gift golf shop credit and keep myself stocked up on golf balls and gloves. But at one particular four-ball event, they maybe weren't feeling the best that morning, but 5 or 6 holes into their round, they came to a par 5. And Jeff, who, to his credit, would always tell you, I was never a very good partner for Bill. Bill carried the team, but they came up to this par 5, and Jeff stood up and hit his second shot to about 3 or 4 feet for eagle. Bill said, "Thanks for finally helping." And Bill went ahead and knocked his long iron into the hole for a 2, a double eagle 2. So Jeff went ahead and putted because he wanted to see if he would make the eagle, which he did. And what's another cool part of this story is I understand the fellow competitors they were playing with went birdie par. So as a foursome, on a par 5, the group went 2, 3, 4, 5. You think that, I mean, how many times has that ever happened, right? And I know he's also qualified for a few USGA championships as well, which just helps at the show to show that the guy really was a stick. So, Bill, thanks again for everything you've done for the Iowa Golf Association. Thanks for everything you've done for me and Caitlin and Clint and the whole IGA staff. It is our great pleasure to be the first ones to welcome you into the Iowa Golf Hall of Fame.
Oh, wow. I got a whole bunch of notes here. I didn't organize a speech much, so I'll probably go through this, but that whole presentation just puts me in the mind of what the old Yankees manager Casey Stengel once said after the Yankees won another World Series, and he answered the first question at the press conference by saying, "I couldn't have done it without my players." Well, that's my case. These guys have been great. I wish I could remember every intern, because there was about 25 or 30 of them, I think. Maybe more, I don't know. But I'm sure glad Noelle's here tonight. She's one of my faves. So, in listening to all the other speeches, Mike, especially, it might be Father's Night, because I wanted to start out by, and this is where the tears come a little bit, because ever since John Brown called me, and Chad called me, it's amazed me how much I thought about the people who aren't here of my family. My mother, my father, my big brother Al, my big sister Karen. But I thought I'd tell a couple stories about the family, about our family history. My father was born in 1919 in Ridgetop, Tennessee, in a family, they were very poor. He was the 8th of 8 sons. His oldest brother, whose name also happened to be Bill Dickens, was 28 years old when my dad was born. He's the only person I know who was born already an uncle. Okay. But he lived a pretty tough existence, and to escape that poverty, as soon as he could, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. And when he went in, he was a talented athlete. He was a sharpshooter with a rifle. And so he was put into really a special ops unit for his first two years. And because of his service with those special units, his reward was his last 2 years, he played baseball in Hawaii. And he was a good baseball player. He was a switch-hitting catcher. And Hawaii was a hotbed for baseball in those days. But in 1940, he mustered out, and he didn't go back to Tennessee. In fact, he never went back to Tennessee, and he never really talked about Tennessee in his entire life. He went to Detroit, where one of his brothers had a job at Chrysler's and got him in at Chrysler's. And while in Detroit, he met a dark-haired, blue-eyed beauty named Ruth Brown, who eventually became my mother. So my roots are rural Tennessee and rural northern Michigan, about as far apart as you can get. And in 1942, well, after Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor came, he was mustered back into the Army. And he was sent out to the West Coast because I guess they were afraid of a Japanese invasion. And my mother traveled by train in 1942 to Olympia, Washington, and they were married in August of 1942. And a few months after that, he was sent to North Africa. And he served in what I call the first half of the Second World War. North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. He loved Sicily and Italy. He told all his war stories were about Sicily and Italy. So then, after a full year, he was mustered back home. He was a quartermaster sergeant, a cook, a baker, and he basically helped feed and train the recruits that went over and finished the thing off. So that made him a hero in and of itself, but as a father, he was the sports dad, he was the scout master, he was heavily invested in us and our lives. In the fall of 1958, I came home from school to find out that he was in the hospital in critical condition. I'll never know the details, but at his factory job, he had slipped on a spot of oil and got hung up in a conveyor that was carrying hot sheet metal and ended up with about a ton of hot sheet metal on top of him. He was burned over 40% of his body and had months of recovery. During that recovery, my mother's brother, Hiram Brown, came to the house, and Hiram was an engineer and a construction superintendent for the Kresge Corporation, traveling the Midwest building Kmarts, a new concept in retail shopping. But he was tired of the travel, and he'd taken up golf while he was traveling, and he'd met some people. So he came to the house and he said, I just got hired as the general manager of a new golf club that's going to be built about 25 miles north of here, out in the farm country of Michigan, north of Detroit, which was still farm country 30 miles north of Detroit at that time. And that whole area, you could transplant it to Iowa and it wouldn't, it's almost identical, you know, so I kind of grew up in a place like Iowa. But I had a life of golf 2 or 3 days a week, and we had a trout stream that ran by our house, and we lived next door to the largest dairy farm in Michigan, and my best friend was of that family. So I learned golf during that time. The first PGA pro that put a club in my hand had the rather colorful name of Cotton Strickland, and he was a transplant from Mississippi, so he was quite a character. But we only did the Romeo thing. My parents, once the course was built, because the first time I ever stepped on a golf course, it was a golf course under construction. It wasn't a golf course yet. And my dad was helping to build the course. When everything was built, he and my mother were going to run the food and beverage operation, the restaurant, the party room, and that was their dream, is to be in the restaurant business. So that lasted about 3 years. Then we were out of golf for about 2 years. They ran another bar and restaurant in Port Huron, Michigan. And then the big break came. They got the job to manage a semi-private 9-hole, beautiful little golf course called Huron Shores Golf Club, about 35 miles north of Port Huron. And that's where I grew up. That's where I spent my years 12 through 17 and really got into golf. Now in those days, there was nothing for junior golfers to play in. My outlet for competition was something called the Michigan Pub Links Golf Association. And it was a big organization, and they allowed 14 and 15, 16-year-olds that could keep up to play. So then the big break for me, the big life-changing event, was that I qualified for the US Junior in 1967. It was played in Oklahoma City, and I was fortunate enough to have a host family because that saved us a lot of money. But my host was a guy named Roger Maxwell, who had just graduated from college, and his parents, we were at their house. They set their rec room up like a bunkhouse. Well, Roger Maxwell's sister was a gal named Susie Maxwell, later to be Susie Maxwell Burning, and Susie won the 1969 and 1972 U.S. Women's Open. So they were a great host. It was a great experience. The runner-up in that event was Andy North, who became pretty famous. I remember I was having a practice round, or I went out after my practice round to look more at the golf course, and this fellow came up to me behind the green, and he was just bragging about his kid, his son, who was putting on the green. And I said, well, you know, and he was obviously from the South. I didn't know exactly where. I mean, I was just this rube from rural Michigan, you know. So I later found out the kid he was bragging about's name was Tom Kite. So I guess he was right. So one thing I would say is that golf has kind of been in and out of my life. You know, I was with it for a while and I'd get away from it. I mean, after high school, and I had a good high school golf career, I went to Michigan State, but I wasn't on scholarship. And, you know, it was tough to get through college. I had to work 2 part-time jobs to make it through, and I was in the last class that freshmen weren't eligible to play varsity golf. And I wanted to tell my Ohio State friends here, I played the Scarlet course once, okay? Well, let me tell you, we were a freshman team and went down and just played 18 holes. I hit all 18 greens in regulation.
Wow.
And I shot 78. You count the putts. But that was my game too. So anyway, after college, I went to Florida for one winter to try to play some competitive golf, but there wasn't a lot going on at that time like there is now. And so I finally just decided I didn't have the financial wherewithal or the temperament really to play competitive golf, and I decided to go another route. And then it was also 73, 74 was right when the first oil embargo crisis came along, and it was hard to get a job. So I worked some fairly low-paying jobs, but in 74, my parents retired to northern Michigan, bought some beautiful property up there. I started going up there, fell in love, moved up to northern Michigan, and I got a job at a 4-season resort called Shanty Creek, and I worked on the golf course, and I worked on the snowmaking and outside maintenance in the wintertime, which was really rough, ugly work. In my second season, they let the superintendent go, and the new superintendent came to me and asked me to be his assistant. And the really good news is that I got a 50-cent an hour bump to $3.25 an hour. Okay, so I was in high cotton at that point. That same year, I got recommended to a vendor who was coming in to open a retail ski shop and run the ski rental for the winter. and I got offered the job of manager of that operation. And that led to me starting to meet all kinds of homeowners, and before long I had my own businesses going, doing services for all these homeowners that needed stuff done and nobody to do it. So I developed really 3 different businesses over the next few years, and I was in business in the construction business for 17 years and almost totally away from golf. And that's kind of the story. It came and went in my life. Well, I also wanted to say, and my next note is about my friend Jeff Rivard, who is really my mentor in golf administration. He's always been one of the leaders in our trade association, the International Association of Golf Administrators. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that group in a couple minutes. But at MSU, I met Jeff when he came back to get his master's degree. He's about 6 years older than me. And almost simultaneously, or the next fall, his brother quit school and he had an empty room in a 2-bedroom house that he was renting. And he called me and said, "Do you want to move in here?" And I said, "Yeah." So it started it's damn near 50 years ago, Jeff, and here we are. But Jeff worked at the pro shop at the Forest Acres, and we played a lot of golf together and had a lot of fun. And then Jeff eventually went into golf administration. He worked first for the Sun Country Golf Association in New Mexico. Then he worked a couple of years on the LPGA Tour. And then he got the job, a pretty good job, with the USGA as the Regional Affairs Manager. And one day, the Golf Association of Michigan Selection Committee was looking for an ED, and they called Jeff because he was a regional guy at the USGA, and they just said, "Well, we're looking for an ED. Do you know anybody that we could call or talk to?" And Jeff said, "Yeah, talk to me." So bottom line is, he became the executive director of the Golf Association of Michigan, and within a few weeks, I always say he pulled me back in once again, and I got committee assignments for the Public Golf Committee of GAM and Public Golf Committee of the USGA, and my USGA and golf administration career really started as a volunteer. And then in 1993, I was at a USGA regional conference at Oakmont, and I met the vice president of the West Virginia Golf Association, and he told me they were looking for an executive director, and I ended up being the executive director, and I took the West Virginia Golf Association from a part-time status to a full-time status, and worked there 3 years. The gentleman I met on the porch at Oakmont's name was Bob Mitchell. When I came to Iowa in 2001, one of my first meetings was with the chairman of the Sani Committee, and his name was Jim Mitchell. And the first question Jim asked me is, "Did you ever meet a guy named Bob Mitchell in West Virginia?" I said, "What a small world." So that was an interesting connection for that. For 3 years in West Virginia, there were 3 great years. We built quite a infrastructure and got that organization off the ground. Then I made kind of what I call my worst mistake, is I took a job back with the Golf Association of Michigan as their Rules and Competitions Director, and quickly discovered that I was entering a very toxic work environment, and it didn't work. And I now think back on it as that mistake taught me more than just about anything else I ever learned.
I was gone by then.
You were gone by then. Thank you for clarifying that. That didn't mean to even imply that, but that's a very good interjection. So I left the GAM after only a few months, and gopped around for 2 or 3 years. Lived in Georgia for a couple of years, and then I got an offer for a job back up in northern Michigan in the construction business, and went up there and worked as a construction superintendent. And that's what I was doing when Jeff called me he was at the Mid-Amateur Championship, and he called me and said Iowa's looking for an executive director. And he kept telling me about these two Iowa guys, and after the first phone call, I thought there was a player from Iowa named Elliot McCoy. Because, you know, he only used last names when he was talking, right? So, I was just confused. The next day, I said, well, call me back when you get more information. So he called me back, and I think he talked a lot to Mike and Gene. Called me back and clarified that there were actually two guys from Iowa. And long story short, I came for an interview, and at age 51, I got a new lease on life, and it's the best years of my life came after that. So, you know, I heard what the guys said about what I've done and some of the stuff that I've read about things that I've done. But again, I did start out, I was a one-man operation for a few months, and then I got Chad on board, and I had a temp secretary, and then we got a second intern, I think, before we started tournament season. But it was the generosity of the USGA and the USGA regional managers that I worked with that really got us on the right course. Because USGA, I gotta be honest with you, USGA gave us a lot of money that first year. And it was not just money, it was computers and infrastructure for the office. And that really got us going. Then I mentioned the IGA earlier, the International Association of Golf Administrators. Well, this is an organization that only executive directors are full members, and then all of your staff are associate members. And we just have an annual, almost week-long conference where we network with EDs from all the states. So, for example, the merger, or what I call the unification of the golf associations, the men's and women's golf association. The word merger, I'm a lifelong bachelor. Merger makes me nervous. When we did that, I got credit for doing all the work, but I got to tell you, the guy that really did a lot of the work was a guy named Jim Demick from the Florida State Golf Association, because they had done the same thing the year before. And I talked at length at the conference with Jim about what they did and how they did it. And then Jim emailed me all of the documents that they used, and the state laws in Florida and Iowa concerning nonprofit organizations merging were similar. So I didn't write the documents, I just copied the right names into the right blanks on the documents Jim sent me. But that's what you gotta do, you know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel to get something right. So I want to just give a shout out to that. And Jeff is one of the founders of the IGA, along with several other of the now departed folks in that industry. So finally, I'm going to come to Iowa, and I'm going to tell you something a little bit weird that nobody knows in Iowa. All my friends in Iowa don't know this, but in 1968, my senior year, our senior play was a musical called The Music Man, written by Meredith Wilson, a Mason City native, and I was Harold Hill. So I already knew there'd been trouble in River City. Okay. The thing I'm most bitter about is I never met Marion the librarian. Okay, but nevertheless, it leads to a story that I want to tell about my older sister Karen. And she was kind of always, along with my mom, one of the two people that I could call and talk to for a long time, and they would listen and sympathize. But Karen also had a pretty good needle. Whenever she was going to needle me, she called me baby brother. So I was lamenting what was going on. She had alluded to it, that we were in some conflicts, and I was having some hard times adjusting. And my sister said, we got to remember the song from the musical, from The Music Man. And I said, what song? They said, the song's called Iowa Stubborn. Okay, and the chorus to Iowa Stubborn is, we're so by God stubborn we can stand touching noses for a week at a time and never see eye to eye. And I'm going, Karen, why are you telling me this story? Iowa Stubborn. She says, baby brother, you should fit right in. And she was right, because I'm pretty stubborn, I guess. It can happen. So I just want to kind of get through the rest of this by acknowledging the various groups that make the job of ED what it is and make it so rewarding. That's all of the volunteers, but especially the boards of directors. You know, the boards of directors to me are like a board of consultants. And I always wanted to get guys on the board who knew stuff I didn't know, you know, because that enhanced what we could get done. And so I thank all of those great people and the many presidents. When I interviewed for the job, I think it was a 4-man committee of Ron Peterson, Ron Van Buskirk, and the late Ted Kopic and the late Murray Hart. And we had a great conversation, and I think I convinced them that I was the guy for the job. And so I thank them for seeing what I could contribute. And then, I'm not gonna be able to remember all the names, but there's some that my good friend David G. Brostrom, who's not here, but he was always just somebody I could call and talk to. I mean, sometimes you get on the phone with Dave and you look down and you've been talking for 2 hours, you know. Leroy Oxley is here. I always think of Leroy, he was the first president I had that was retired. He wasn't working, so he had more time, and he's a wise man. And he was a corporate manager, and he had a lot of insight into things like gender issues that we were dealing with approaching our unification of the organizations. Jamie Blackburn, Joe Keogh, Bill Eby. I want to mention Ron Van Buskirk again because I want to tell a story about him. Later on, when the staff was totally capable of running the events, Ron and I became 4-ball partners, first playing in the senior division and then later playing in the super senior division. And we were always in the hunt for last place, but that was okay. You know, we had fun. But on the first hole of the 4-ball that was played up at the Ridge course up in northwest Iowa, Matt Nice is a pro up there, and I had taken to playing the yellow ball. The yellow ball had become fashionable, and so I tee up my beautiful Titleist with the script lettering Titleist on it, and I hit my tee shot down the right side. And I go up and I kind of hit a snarly hook to the left in this fairly thick rough. And then I hit another one up that ends up in the rough short of the green. And then I chop it out of there. It's about 10 feet from the hole. And I go to mark my ball, and instead of the beautiful script Titleist, it was yelling back at me in all cap letters, range ball. Okay? So then you say the word you always say to your 4-ball partner, your hole. Okay? Because I don't know which shot I hit the range ball rather than my yellow Titleist. But Ron and I had a lot of fun doing that, and I think we played sometimes, Leroy, with you and your partner, and it was a lot of fun. So the last thing I have on my notes here, I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about, but I just wanted to talk again and say something about the staff and the USGA intern, because I am the #1 user of the USGA intern program, and I was always blown away by the quality of the applicants. They were like the quality of the Sani applicants, you know, just top notch, And so we had so many great ones. And of course, Chad joined me 4 months in. But way back, I mentioned that ski shop, the guy I worked for in the ski shop when we had our first lunch, and I was asking him about hiring, you know, what's the rules for hiring? And he gave me rule number 1. He said, rule number 1 is always hire people smarter than you. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean smarter on every subject, but people, again, that know stuff you don't know. For example, in the bio, it gives me credit for developing a website for the IGA. Well, here's how I developed that website. I went to Chad's office, said, Chad, we need a website. Do what you can to figure out how to do it, and let me know what it costs. And that's how I developed the website. Thank you very much. Well, the second rule I developed on my own was delegate like crazy. Don't try to do everything yourself. Don't think that you're the only one that can do it best, because there's more than one best out there. And I think that's maybe one of the things that my employees maybe appreciated as much as anything else is I gave them assignments and I let them do them, and they were in charge of them. And for a while, maybe I worked for them on something, but we always had such a harmony in our staff. And it's among my finest memories to just think about, like, when we were finished with a tournament and we're clearing the course and loading the tournament trailer, and we would be doing it and there would be almost no conversation because everybody knew what to do, and it was the men and the women were lifting the boxes and we just got it done. And I was very proud of that type of teamwork. And then I just want to close again by thanking Mike Capola for everything you've done to make what was a vision that we kept nudging along, and we finally got it right. And I am just in awe. And the thing I'm in awe most of, because I know of other state golf houses, I've visited some of them, and this is the only one I know of that's paid for totally with donations, and it's paid for. And I think that makes the IGA a pretty rich organization now. They're not the poor boys you were saying, Steve. So that's, being a part of that is what I think I'm most proud of, and I'm just in total awe of that building over there. And I just want to end by thanking all of you for making me feel at home.